Good morning, boys and girls. I'm going to be reading chapter 5 from Stuart Little. With being out of school, this has kind of gotten put to the side, and that's okay. So this is Rescued, and you can follow along with me. And then I'd also like you maybe to read it with your parents and talk about it a little bit. We're going to leave off here, and then we're going to pick up after the Easter break. With chapter 6, but this is a good place to take a little bit of a break. So you remember when we left off, something kind of scary happened to Stuart. He was trapped, but nobody knew where he was. So from the title of the chapter, Rescued, we have an idea of what happened. George was in favor of ripping up the pantry floor. He ran and got his hammer, his screwdriver, and an ice pick. "I'll have the old floor up in double quick time," he said, inserting his screwdriver under the edge of the first board and giving a good, vigorous pry. "We will not rip up this floor till we have had a good search," announced Mrs. Little. "That's final, George. You can put that hammer away where you got it." "Oh, all right," said George. "I see that nobody in the house cares anything about Stuart but me." Mrs. Little began to cry. "My poor little son," she said. "I know he'll get wedged somewhere." "Just because you can't travel comfortably in a mouse hole doesn't mean that he isn't a perfectly suitable place for a Stuart," said Mr. Little. "Just don't get yourself all worked up." "Maybe we ought to lower some food to him," suggested George. "That's what the state police did when a man got stuck in a cave." George darted into the kitchen and came running back with a dish of applesauce. "We can pour some of this in, and it will go down to where he is." George spooned out a bit of applesauce and started to poke it into the hole. "Stop that," bellowed Mr. Little. "George, will you kindly help me handle the situation? Put the applesauce away immediately." Mr. Little glared fiercely at George. "I was just trying to help my brother," said George. "Let's all call to Stuart," said Mrs. Little. "It's quite possible that the mouse hole branches and twists and that he lost his way." "Very well," said Mr. Little. "I'll count to 3. We'll all call, and then we'll keep perfectly still for 3 seconds, listening for the answer." He took out his watch. Mr. and Mrs. Little and George got down on their hands and knees and put their mouths as close as possible to the mouse hole. They all called, "Stuart," and then they all kept perfectly still for 3 seconds. Stuart, from his cramped position inside the rolled-up shade, heard them yelling and called, "Here I am!" But he had such a weak voice and was so far inside the shade that they didn't hear him. Again, 1, 2, 3. "Stuart!" It was no use. No answer was heard. Mrs. Little was so upset. Mr. Little went to the telephone and called the Bureau of Missing Persons. But when the man asked for the description of Stuart, and he was told that he was only 2 inches high, he hung up in disgust. George, meantime, went down a cellar and hunted around to see if he could find the other entrance into the mouse hole. He moved a great many trunks, suitcases, flower pots, baskets, boxes, and broken chairs from one end of the cellar to the other in order to get at the section of wall where he thought was likeliest. But he found no hole. He did, however, come across an old discarded mowing machine of Mr. Little's, and he became interested in this, carried it upstairs with some difficulty, and spent the rest of the morning mowing. When lunchtime came, everybody had forgotten about breakfast. All 3 sat down to a lamb stew which Mrs. Little had prepared, but it was a sad meal, each one trying not to stare at the small empty chair which Stuart always occupied, right next to Mrs. Little's glass of water. No one could eat. So great was the sorrow. George ate a bit of dessert, but nothing else. When lunch was over, Mrs. Little broke out crying again, and she thought Stuart must be dead. "Nonsense," growled Mr. Little. "If he is dead," said George, "we ought to pull down the shades all through the house." And he raced to the windows and began pulling down the shades. "George," shouted Mr. Little in an exasperated tone, "if you don't stop acting in an idiotic fashion, I will have to punish you. We're having enough trouble today without having to cope with your foolishness." But George had already run into the living room and began to darken it to show his respect for the dead. He pulled a cord, and out dropped Stuart against the windowsill. "Well, for the love of Pete," said George. "Look who's here, Mom." "It's about time somebody pulled down that shade," remarked Stuart. "That's all I can say." He was quite weak and hungry. Mrs. Little was so overjoyed to see him that she kept right on crying. Of course, everybody wanted to know how it happened. "It was simply an accident that might happen to anybody," said Stuart. "As for my hat and cane being found at the entrance to the mouse hole, you can draw your own conclusions." And that's the end of chapter 5. The next chapter is A Fair Breeze. And as I said, this is a good place to leave off until we come back from our nice break.